Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Hey, Ron, how are you? Yeah, ready? You sure? Yeah, I just found out about it the other day. It was basically Thursday. You have students? Yeah. Well, no, I didn't hear. No, I'm just having to reach them. Well, I think this one was kind of the last year one, because it was so many times. And they know it. It's something like every year, but they don't know why. But you know, yeah, while you're here, I think he often does that, like on the secrets. So you're still talking to him. So yeah, so I couldn't remember specifically like when it's on. I know I heard it's yeah, it's wrapping up tonight. I think we might go to it's like
I just didn't know if she got something. I don't mind doing it, I just don't know.
Good morning, everyone. Let's open our Bibles to Matthew, first chapter. Continue our study here. And Barry, could you lead us in an opening prayer as we get started?
Father in heaven, Father, we thank you. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come here this morning, study more of your word. We pray that we will do so with an open mind, dig into your word, apply to our lives as we should. We thank you, Father, for your Son who came and died for our sins. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So as we're getting started in our study in Matthew, as was pointed out in our last couple classes, this book begins with genealogy, which I know isn't always the most interesting thing to read. Whenever we're reading through our Bibles, we seem to get there and it's easy to just skip over it. It's easy to just glance through it really quickly and not give a whole lot of thought to it. But we've discussed in the past couple classes the importance of genealogy and why it's fitting for this book to begin with it. Jesus was an important figure that not just in his day, but that God's word had been talking about throughout history and predicting and emphasizing and building up the importance of. And so when it came time for him to be born into this world, it was important to know where he came from and who he was, both in his in who he was as far as his physical descendant from David and from Abraham, and his nature of who he was, being the Son of God. And this genealogy helps to establish that. And Chris discussed in our last class how there's other things we could learn through this genealogy and kind of looking at it and looking beyond just the list of people and how it eventually came to Jesus, but also lessons that we could learn from those people in there and how groups of them can kind of give us an insight into how God deals with man, how his plan ends up being fulfilled, and his promises are fulfilled. We looked in our last class about how the genealogy that we read about here shows us that personal responsibility is something that is important for us, because that's how God judges us, and how we read about good and bad kings and fathers in this list who had each kind of father had good and bad children, and how we can influence the outcome of our children, how every person in the end is responsible for themselves and can make those choices. And so we see that just looking at some of the examples in this genealogy. And another lesson that we could find in these names, which Chris was going to get to, but he didn't have time to, and was something I wanted to touch on as well, is that God doesn't just use the righteous for his purpose, right? That he is able to use anyone for his purpose, and he oftentimes does. And I think there's lessons for that through this genealogy, and there's lessons by that for us today as well. One of the interesting things in genealogy is when you look back through at how the Jews kept up with their heritage, their genealogies, is that it was often listed through the males in the lineage, right? When you would list who you came from, it was through the fathers, and that's a typical way of doing it. That's a typical way of looking back through a person's history back in this time. Whereas now in our family trees, oftentimes they're much more complete when we make those, when we look at those lists everyone. Whereas oftentimes in these genealogies, it was just through the men. But in this genealogy, we notice that there are 4 women mentioned in here as well, which is very interesting. Not just because they're women, but also because of who these people were and how unexpected it was, how they're not being used to brag about how great Jesus's lineage was, how royal it was, how it's very real, it's very truthful about who he actually came from, and how it wasn't always it wasn't always people who had no mistakes in their lives. That it was that God brought Jesus through many people who had questionable lives or questionable pasts. And I think we see that here as we look at these four women that are mentioned. So let's look there in our main text in Matthew. And look at where some of these are mentioned. And the first one we see pretty early on here in verse 3. Carl, can you read that for us?
And Judas begat Perez and Zerah of Tamar, and Perez begat Ishram, and Ishram begat Aram.
Okay, so the first one that we read about here is Judah having a child Perez by Tamar. And Tamar is that first woman that's mentioned here. And we know that that as we look at who Tamar was, that she there were a couple things about her that that we would consider unrighteous or mistakes that she made. And we see in Genesis, let's go back to Genesis 38. And let's read verses 1 through 4. And Chuck, can you read that for us?
It came to pass at the time that Judah departed from his brothers, visited a certain Ephraimite, whose name was Hira. And Judah saw that the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shia, and he married her and went to her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and he called his name Onan.
Okay, and also, Paulie, can you read verses 12 through 16?
Now, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comfortable and went up to his shearers at Timnah. He and his friend Hira, the Adullam, and he was told Tamar, saying, "Look, your father-in-law is coming up to shear his sheep." So she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself in and sat in an open place, which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was born, and she was not given to him as a wife. Then Judah saw her. He thought she was a harlot, because she had covered her face. Then he turned to her by the way and said, "Please let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter. So she said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?"
Okay, so we see not only was this situation here, him thinking she was a prostitute, but it was also an instance of incest, right? Something that wouldn't be. It's not something we would look back on with trying to claim how great we were or how great of a lineage we came from, right? This isn't something you would brag about. This is something that may be hidden or covered. But the gospel doesn't do that. It uses this. It proclaims who Jesus came from, and that it was a lineage of someone who came from an incestuous relationship. Right there, and you find this throughout the gospel that it's oftentimes very honest, that it doesn't try to clean things up, that it's an account of history and of what really happened, and this is what really happened in Jesus's past through his ancestors. In Matthew, back in our main text, in verse 5. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Jerry, can you read that for us?
Matthew 5, verse
1?
Mm-hmm.
And
Or,
save the money.
no, I'm sorry, Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Sorry if I said that wrong.
Verse 5. And Salmon begot Booz, and Rahab the cunt. I can't even pronounce these words.
Oh, it's okay. Julie, can you read that for us? It's okay. I know there are little tongue twisters there.
And Sam, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse.
Okay, so we also see that part of his lineage was through Rahab. Right? What do we know about Rahab? Name should sound pretty familiar to us. Barry, do you have your hand up?
There's a part mentioned in James too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see her mentioned a couple times in the New Testament. But let's actually go back and look at her story back in Joshua chapter 2. You know, we all remember the story of Jericho and how the Israelites would march around the city multiple times as part of the destruction of it, how the walls fell down. We're pretty familiar with that part. But it's interesting the role that Rahab played in all this, and to consider why her, you know, why she is mentioned, why she's carried through, not just mentioned here by name, but also in the New Testament, looking back at her as an example of faith. To someone who we may not give much thought to as we're just reading the story, because it's like the least amazing thing in this story that happened, right? There wasn't anything miraculous with her happening. It was, you know, with how God empowered Israel to conquer the city. But she did play an important role. So we see there as we look at Joshua 2, it says in verse 1, and Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. There's all kinds of discussions we can get into, and thinking about why they would choose to stay with a prostitute for their for their stay as they were basically secretly trying to spy out the city. But we know that even with their attempts to be secretive and to go and basically do reconnaissance on this city, that not much slips by the police or the rulers of this, or the people who are there in charge of of keeping the city safe and who are on the lookout will notice that the word of Israel, the reputation of Israel, what was going on, how they crossed the Red Sea, and how they were defeating all these cities, the news had spread, and that they knew, and they were watching out for that. Because look what happened in verse 2. It says, and it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Okay, so as was normal practice in that time, the first person that would get alerted when something was off, if there was something detected that was wrong, the news would need to go straight to the king. And we see that that's what happened here, that news that they had, that these people from Israel had come here to spy things out. Verse 4 or verse 3, then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, so they even knew where they went, right? They even, the people who reported this even know where these people went, where they stayed. And the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. Verse 4, but the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. And the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. In verse 8, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. What is she doing here in saying this? We see that she just deceived these soldiers who came and were looking for these men. And here in her conversation with the men, we find out something about her. What do we learn? That she believed in God, Barry. Okay, that she wanted protection. Why would you want protection, though? If you believe that God had the power to come and destroy your city, right? So she has faith in that God was not only powerful enough to do what they had heard he was going to do, but also that he was able to do it. He was going to do it, and she knew it enough to say that she knows the Lord has given them the land. Right? We see that faith shining through in not only her profession here, but in her actions and what she did for these men, putting her own possibly her own life at risk in doing that. Verse 10 goes on to say how for they have heard, the people in this land, this was something that was known at this time. The reputation of Israel preceded them in coming here. Verse 10, for they had heard about how the Lord let the people cross through the Red Sea by drying it up. And what they did to the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. So they knew what Israel was up to, but not just what Israel was up to, but that God was with them in doing those things. Many of them might not have believed it, but we know that Rahab did here. And there was fear in all of them, as we see there in verse 11, that as soon as they heard it, their hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is a God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Okay, so again, her recounting this, what she knows to be true here. And then she asks for this protection, like Barry mentioned in the next verses, verse 12 and on. She says, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you will also deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and my mother and my brothers and sisters and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. Okay, again, recognizing that God has the power to do this, and also that there's an opportunity here for her to be saved through that, through the destruction that was coming, through the judgment that was coming. And the men went on and agreed to her request there in verse 14. Our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. And then she lets them down through the window by a rope, and they tell her how to mark her house for when they come, and she does that. She follows through with that. She hangs the red cord out the window, and so they know where to. So the army knows what place to leave alone, who not to destroy in the conquering of this city. And so we have her as this example of faithfulness that's pointed out both in Hebrews and in James, like was mentioned before. And let's just go and read a couple of those, or read those two accounts. First, let's look at Hebrews 11, verse 31. And Josh, can you read that for us? Hebrews 11, verse 31.
By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who believed, but she had received the spies.
Okay, so she received the spies, and we read that she did that by faith. that she received them because of the faith that she had in God and was spared because of that. The very faith that brought down the walls of Jericho, as we read in the previous verse there, is the same kind of faith that saved Rahab, in that, and the same kind of faith that we can look up to. And let's also turn over to James chapter 2. And Brittany, can you read that for us? James 2, verse 25.
The same way was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works which she received the messengers who sent out by another way.
Okay, so here we have her being justified by, again, this isn't conflicting with what we just read in Hebrews. She was justified by her faith there in Hebrews. Here, justified by her works. What were her works? Her works were the actions that we read about, inviting them in peace, and you know, even her actions of lying to the guards, right? This is something. Have you ever wondered about this? How when you read the story of Rahab, right, we know that that lying is a sin, right? The lying is something that can keep us from going to heaven. It's one of the measures that God uses to that can be used against us when we're judged. You know, when we read about in Revelation that liars don't have a place in heaven. So how do we square that? How do we look at what she's been justified by? And yet we read in the story of how she, you know, part of what she did was deceiving, was being deceptive to those who were looking for the spies. Jerry?
I wanted to protect those men.
Okay. What, that she lied in because she had a better cause? Okay.
You said it before, God uses people that aren't always what we consider someone that God would use.
Yeah. Right. And this, you know, this can turn into a bigger discussion, I think, you know, because there's, you know, we have to be careful when thinking of things as, you know, no matter what you do, as long as the ends justify the means, that it can be justified. We know that's not always true. But it's also good to think about where Rahab was, where she was coming from. She was a prostitute. She wasn't familiar with all the laws of the Jews, of the laws of God. She was coming from a pretty low place, as we might judge it ourselves or characterize it. And her faith motivated her to do the things that she did. And not that lying was always going to be okay for her, not that we could even justify it as being definitely right in this situation as well. But God looked favorably on her for what she did and where she was, and the results of what she did and where it was coming from. Right? It's not like she was willfully transgressing a law in lying. She did what she thought was best to act on her faith. And we see her being commended for that here. We see her saying that we can look up to that kind of faith, that faith is something that we can learn from. And we see that both in the belief that she had in the actions that she took to save these men. Were there any other comments on that before we move on? Don't want to miss any hands there. So again, noting how Rahab was used and even praised throughout the New Testament here, you know, being used for great things, even when she was someone who had made mistakes, who was living in a way that God would not approve of, but yet He was able to use her. He was able to even justify her by not by how good she was, but through her faith and through that what that motivated her to do. And in our main text in Matthew chapter 6 or Matthew chapter 1, we again read of if we look down in verse 6, it says, I keep going to the chapter 6 as well. Matthew 1, verse 6. We see, and Jesse, the father of David the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Who is the wife of Uriah? Bathsheba, right? We studied this not too long ago. The woman who David had an affair with, and who then went on to have her husband killed, who had a child through that relationship that ended up dying, but yet she is used here to say that that Solomon was the child of David and Uriah, and mentioning that here specifically. And we studied that story pretty recently, so we won't go back into that now. But just another example of how God had this purpose that carried through even these relationships that were defiled in some way, even through these people who made these mistakes, and how we can kind of see that and learn that lesson through this genealogy. And lastly, the fourth one that we have mentioned is Ruth. Right? And what do we know about Ruth? Brittany? She was a foreigner, right? She was not we know that she wasn't a Jew, that she wasn't somebody who came from Abraham, that she was, while we read a lot of good things about her, that she was very morally good, that she had just noble intentions, and the Jews at that time would have looked at her as like intermingling with royal blood, right? That she was basically diluting the purity of trying to stay within the Jewish heritage or the Jewish bloodline, but yet she's mentioned here. What was that?
She was very devoted to her mother.
Yeah, very devoted. Right. We see that kind of that moral uprightness, right, and like how devoted she was, how faithful she was to those who she cared about. Yeah.
She was also extremely poor. Which
Yeah, exactly right. We know she had to gather from the corners of the fields, which is where, like, that's what the Jews were commanded to leave those unharvested. That way that the poor could come and pick and eat of those things. So right, all these things that don't put her in this position of look who Jesus came from and how great it is, but rather look how humble of an origin in a lot of these situations Jesus came from. And why would that be important to kind of emphasize throughout this genealogy? What were the Jews? What was the Jews' perception of the Messiah and who he was going to be? We know it wasn't exactly what Jesus was because they rejected him. They questioned so many things about him, both where he came from, like city-wise. Is this not the carpenter's son? Right? They would look down on who this person was. And also by this lineage, we see him being connected to David and to Abraham, right? People from whom the Jews knew and could expect the Messiah to come from. But he wasn't made out to be this powerful, unrelatable person. No, he came from a lineage that was of real people who made mistakes. And, I think one of the lessons we can learn from that is that Jesus was someone who was going to show mercy on the very same people who we read about in his lineage, and the very same kind of mistakes that people would make, that he was there to show mercy on those people, to have pity on them, to reach out to them, to want to save them. It wasn't just about who could follow the law the closest and to set up some kind of pure kingdom here of just the Jews and have them rise to power. No, he was here to bring people into this family. Another reason why he was rejected by some of the Jews. Let's look over. I just want to look at kind of a passage here that kind of gives us a little insight into this in Matthew chapter 21. Matthew 21. I lost my place here. Give me 1 second. Let's read verses 28 through 31. Matthew 21, verses 28 through 31. And Lois, could you read that for us?
But what think ye? A certain man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, Son, go work today in my vineyard. He answered and said, I will not. But afterward he repented and went. And he came to the second and said likewise. And he answered and said, I go, sir, and went not. Whether of them did the will of his father? They say unto him the first. Jesus saith unto them, Verily I say unto you, that the publicans and the harlots go into the kingdom of God before you.
Okay, this is an interesting response to these Jews, isn't it? That in this parable that he gives of these 2 sons and their different responses to their father, right? One of these sons represents the Jews, especially the self-righteous ones, like the Pharisees, right? Who would say they would acknowledge the father. They would follow some of the commandments. They would pride themselves on how faithful they were. But yet we know their heart was far from God. They weren't completely giving themselves to God. That they were equivalent to the son who said he would, but then wouldn't actually do it. And that was kind of the attitude that they had. They were happy to bind things on others, but they themselves would not be satisfied having the right attitudes and doing the right things. They would find excuses not to do stuff. Whereas there are going to be some who, yes, have done wrong things. They may have rejected God so far up, in their life, just like the son had rejected his father's command up until after he asked him. But they repented and decided, I need to do this. This is something that is right, and they would follow through and actually have a change of heart, and a heart that was then devoted and committed to do what God asked them to do. And those are the people that are listed here as tax collectors and harlots or prostitutes. And Jesus came from some of those kind of people, and he was also there to save those kind of people, to bring them in to his family spiritually, just as much as he came from that kind of thing in his family physically. And so I think we could find interesting parallels there from where Jesus came from to what he was here to do. And how he was opening his kingdom to the sinners, to those who were sick, to those who were not part of what many considered God's people of that day, to open it up to the Gentiles, to everyone. And whether or not this was exactly Matthew's intention and these people that he picked, we don't know for sure.